Right. First of all, thank you to Holly for inviting me to talk about inclusion. Now, I've been thinking about inclusion for a while now, and I finally put all these ideas into a paper. Uh, but there's been considerable resistance from journals to accept this paper because it goes against the grain. But I managed it in the end. The word inclusion is used a lot these days, but often without much thought. That's really the motivation of this paper. And I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. Blanket inclusion is nonsense. There is plenty of literature on social exclusion and the political vision of including the marginalized, but in the academic literature, there is very little conceptual analysis of the term inclusion. Holly published an important paper last year, 2024, Is Inclusion Good?, where she argues that inclusion comes with costs attached for those who are supposed to do the including. My contention is that we don't have to include everyone. There are actually constraints on inclusion. One of these constraints is eligibility, and the other constraint is forfeiture. There may be more constraints, but these two seem to be central to me. I mean, another constraint, I think that's what one thing I got from Holly's paper is that uh, the costs attached to an inclusion practice could be a constraint. Now, social justice activists assume that everyone should be included, particularly the marginalized. But this is a mistake. This holds in the private sphere as well as in the institutional settings of the public sphere. My mother, for example, would invite all my friends who were at our house to eat with us during meal times. They were included. But she didn't invite all the neighborhood children. The eligibility criterion was being my friend and being at my house at lunchtime. Although my mother being Croatian, she would have loved to invite all the children and feed them. And so this is the same in the public sphere. Uh, there are criteria. A central purpose of social institutions is to allocate benefits and burdens equitably among the members of society. The logic of institutions requires that they apply eligibility criteria, and consequently, some individuals are included and some are excluded. Old age pensioners here in the UK get a winter fuel allowance. But if you are 25 years or if you are a 25-year-old city trader, you don't get that allowance. Although the government recently got rid of the winter fuel allowance for old people. Uh, yeah. Another example, if you want to submit your novel to the Women's Prize for Fiction, also here in the UK, you need to be female. Although the eligibility conditions were recently changed to include trans women. So you see, inclusion depends on eligibility. And you also see that eligibility conditions are not rigid. They can be widened or narrowed. And in the case of the Women's Prize for Fiction, they were widened to include trans women. Now, social life is a kaleidoscope of inclusion and exclusion practices. This makes social life possible. Without inclusion or exclusion practices, social life would be chaotic, if not impossible. All distinctions, old, young, disabled, male, female, citizen, foreigner, etc., would disappear or become meaningless. It would be like this, a situation like this. Imagine you're at a football game supporting your team, but if there is blanket inclusion, then all fans could just flood the pitch, get on the field, join in, and either play for their team or even play for the opposite team. So the result will be chaos. So blanket inclusion is an incoherent idea. When someone makes a claim for inclusion, our first port of call is eligibility. So we need to ask at least three questions. Are the excluded eligible? If not, why not? Should they be eligible for inclusion? So inclusion conceptually entails that some individuals might be excluded. You cannot have inclusion without exclusion and vice versa. But even if you are included via eligibility, you can forfeit that right through wrongdoing. Why is all this important? Well, it has a bearing on current controversies and any future policy decisions. For example, when it comes to voting rights, naturalization of foreign nationals, migration, and so on and so on. Now, a little bit about the history of inclusion. So the discussion about inclusion entered public consciousness via debates in educational theory in the 20th century. And these debates were particularly prominent in the 1960s and 70s. They were about the question of segregating or integrating children with disabilities in regular classrooms or in regular classroom settings. So what can we learn from this debate? Well, disabled children are eligible for mainstream education because the relevant criterion, the eligibility criterion, is being a child. Disability is not a relevant criterion. Wheelchair users, for example, can and should be integrated into the classroom. Who is not eligible for mainstream education, we can ask? Well, grown-ups and children's pets. There's a relevant difference here. Mainstream education is designed for children. There are other places for adult education, and pets don't need to go to school because school is not designed for them, and they will not benefit from the education on offer. Although I hear the Americans have doggy colleges. So some children may think it would be a great idea to take their pets to school, but they're not eligible. So if there's no relevant difference, then we may treat people equally. Having red hair or being a girl is not a relevant difference in the school context. They are all eligible for mainstream education. Or another example, only men are eligible for a prostate exam and only women are eligible for a smear test. The relevant criterion here is sex. If we were promoting blanket inclusion, then we might include people who are not eligible according to existing criteria. For example, tourists could vote in national elections if they happen to be in the country. Over 21 footballers could join the under 21 category. Nosy people without an alcohol problem could join AA meetings just because they want to know what's going on there. The result of blanket inclusion would be that institutional distinctions and categories became meaningless, and there would be no need to allocate burdens and benefits equitably among citizens. Everyone is the same in the scenario. So this means that we need to be able to justify the eligibility criteria, particularly to those who are being excluded. We could explain to adults who are keen on education that they do not qualify for the mainstream education of children because they are grown-ups rather than children. And if they are reasonable people, they will accept this. There are adult education classes after all. Now, existing inclusion and exclusion practices are normally not arbitrary. It's very likely that Trump is, his practices are probably arbitrary. Now, we know that girls' schools improve the educational attainment for girls. So to help the scholastic achievement of girls, it is sometimes necessary to exclude boys, particularly in science classes where boys tend to dominate and hog all the equipment or push the girls aside. Now, Holly has introduced a helpful distinction in her paper, the distinction between segregation and separation. The segregation of black people in the US was disempowering, but the separation of girls from boys in school can be empowering for girls. Exclusion is wrong if the aim is segregation, but right if the aim is separation that would bring about a social benefit, in my example, for girls, but also for all of society. Note that boys are not disadvantaged because girls' schools exist, and male athletes are not disempowered because of the female category in sports. Sometimes we introduce inclusion initiatives, and these initiatives can have at least two distinct motivations, and there's nothing wrong with that. The first motivation could be to prevent wrongful or unlawful discrimination, and the second, to facilitate the integration of newcomers into social practices. So to the first, children should not exclude potential playmates because they are redheads. This would be wrongful discrimination, or because they are foreigner. Don't play with that foreign child. Similarly, every child, qua being a child, is entitled to an education. So it doesn't matter here if the child is smaller or taller than others, or that the child has mastered the alphabet already, or that the child is a girl. None of these characteristics are relevant when it comes to being entitled to an education. In many contexts, we wish to facilitate the integration of newcomers. If children in the playground ignore one particular child who just moved into the neighborhood, then parents might step in and say, why don't you let Charlie play too? Or one of the children, a reasonable one, an older one, could say to the others, let's include Charlie. Why exclude Charlie? So if you start a new job, then it is a good idea to be assigned a mentor who will show you the ropes and introduce you to the colleagues. If you are invited to a party where everyone knows everyone else, then it is the job of the host and of the guest to introduce you to the others and make you feel welcome. So the purposes of inclusion here, non-discrimination and integration, presuppose eligibility. There is no need to explain to the delivery guy how the photocopier in the office works. He's the delivery guy. He just brings the stuff, the packages, and goes. He doesn't need the photocopier. So we may discriminate in the positive sense. That's the other thing that the social justice activists ignore. They always think discrimination is always bad. Well, there are two senses of discrimination, one positive, one negative. But we may discriminate in the positive sense between employees and visitors to the office. And there's no need to integrate a teenager into the games of little children in the sandpit, because that teenager is not eligible. The sandpit is for little children, not for teenagers. Consequently, we may exclude them from certain activities and/or we don't have to integrate them into those activities. So as we can see from these examples, there are often facilitators, parents, mentors, party hosts who create the conditions for integration. However, they cannot establish integration by themselves because the individual in question, the person that is to be included or integrated, they must also do their bit. So, for example, a child who hasn't learned to count yet will not do well in a counting game and may temporarily be excluded or given a different task until they have learned to count. A party guest who refuses to engage with the others or is obnoxious will be difficult to integrate. Or a party guest who is extremely boring, nobody will, of course, want to spend a lot of time with them. So it would fall to the vicar at the party to talk to the to the boring person. Well, that's okay. Uh, Now, another example. A new employee who turns out to be a sexist pig may not be included in social activities for that reason. So this much on eligibility, which is the first constraint on inclusion. Now to the second constraint, forfeiture. So this kicks in, forfeiture, after eligibility has been established. We all know, excuse me, you can lose a right through voluntarily relinquishing or transferring that right. For example, by entering into a contract. I can sell you my car, or I could give it to you as a present, or I could waive a right that I have. Let's imagine that kids playing football out of my house or next door, and their ball always lands in my garden, and then they ring the bell every day. Can we please get our ball out of your garden? Then I say to the kids, listen, kids, there's no need to ring the bell 5 times a day. Just jump over the wall, get your ball, and everything's fine. So in this case, I have waived my right to control who gets access to my garden for these kids. So I have voluntarily given up my right. But there is also a non-voluntary loss of rights, and that is called forfeiture. Um, I mean, John Locke talks about that. So you can read up on that. It is the loss of rights due to wrongdoing. This can occur if one's behavior falls below a certain standard of proper behavior, as the American legal scholar Joel Feinberg has said. A classic example for behavior that triggers the forfeiture of rights is crime. By committing a crime, the wrongdoer forfeits the right not to be punished. We all have an immunity from punishment. In Germany, for example, prisoners, in addition to losing the right not to be punished, may also lose the right to vote if they have committed treason. And we also find this in many US states. Felons lose voting rights, sometimes while they are incarcerated, sometimes even after finishing their sentence, living in the community. In some states, they are still barred from voting, sometimes forever, sometimes for up to 7 years. So in Germany, anyone with a prison sentence of 1 or more years cannot stand for public office. They have forfeited the right to be a member of parliament, mayor, or local councillor for life. And this makes sense because why would we want criminals to become lawmakers or local politicians? So the forfeiture theory, in my view, works well here. Now, this much for forfeiture. Now, let's look at the marginalized, who are often put forward by the social justice activists. Now, marginalization by itself is not a reason for blanket inclusion. This would merely be an appeal to emotion. But many social justice activists believe that marginalization warrants inclusion, and this does not follow. Eligibility claims are context dependent. We need to distinguish between justified and unjustified marginalization. Racists, people who believe in alien abduction, incels, or members of a militia group in the US fall into the first category. Their marginalization is justified. Despite their horrid or questionable beliefs, they are eligible for inclusion in many areas of life. Medical treatment, having their children educated, buying ice cream, or going to the cinema. But an aspiring teacher who is a racist loses their eligibility claim to become a school teacher through forfeiture because they're a racist. We reject their eligibility claim outright because we don't want children to be exposed to hate. Similarly, members of a militia group forfeit their eligibility claim to join the military because they promote insurrection. And if we discover that serving military personnel belong to such a group, then they forfeit the right to serve their country, meaning they lose their original eligibility claim. But they can still buy ice cream or go to the cinema. So they're not excluded from everything, they're excluded in some particular context. The same goes for the unjustly marginalized. Their eligibility claims are also context dependent. Being disadvantaged in social life does not mean that all their eligibility claims are valid. If a member of the Hispanic community in the US wants to teach physics in high school, then the basis for granting their eligibility claim is not that they belong to a marginalized group. It is because they have a physics degree. Conversely, if they don't have a physics degree, then they can be rightly excluded from making the shortlist for the job. Similarly, if the qualifying time to enter the Boston Marathon is 3 hours, then a runner who belongs to a marginalized group does not have a valid eligibility claim if their time is 3 hours and 10 minutes. That would be unfair to all other runners. This much on the marginalized. Now I'm coming to the end. So to summarize, before we decide that someone needs to be included, we need first to establish that they are eligible for inclusion in a particular context. And if their behavior falls short of a certain standard, usually behavior that harms others or views that we find abhorrent, for example, racism, then they may temporarily or permanently forfeit their right to inclusion. Inclusion claims don't last forever. Society or the in-group often narrow or widen the eligibility criteria. So this is either done because of political expediency or for justice considerations. Now, to the first, political expediency, it used to be the case in Germany that school teachers could only be German citizens because they are civil servants, and all civil servants are German nationals in Germany. Now, when there was a shortage of teachers, the eligibility criterion here, being a German national, was, became porous, was widened, and foreigners could also be teachers in school. And I suspect, political expediency, what Trump is doing right now, I think that would probably come under ideological reasons. So he's fiddling with eligibility criteria for ideological reasons, and that would probably also come under political expediency. Now let's look at justice considerations. They can also motivate us to widen or narrow eligibility criteria. For instance, it is, of course, unjust to exclude girls and women from playing sports. That's what the Taliban are doing. The right thing to do for them would be to widen the criteria for playing sports and include girls and women. Now, an example for narrowing the criteria would be doing away with the legacy admissions for college in the US. So the fact that one of your parents or grandparents attended a particular college or university then becomes irrelevant for your own admission. And fortunately, more and more colleges in the US are doing away with the idea of legacy admissions. So they are narrowing the eligibility conditions, the criteria. So eligibility claims may be rejected outright when they pose a threat to a particular institution. For example, militia members who are bent on insurrection endanger the functioning of the military, and racist teachers threaten the functioning of a school. Admitting a minority athlete who doesn't meet the qualifying time for the Boston Marathon would be unfair to all other runners, those meeting the standards and those who were excluded because they didn't meet the standard. It would make a mockery of sport. In contrast, match fixers, dopers, cheaters, or intentional rule breakers, although they are eligible and they are playing, they may be excluded from athletic endeavor via forfeiture, via their wrongdoing, because they pose a threat to the integrity of the game. So the lesson is, unjustified marginalization is a social ill, and we should do away with it. But it doesn't establish any eligibility claims, and neither does justified marginalization. It all depends on the context. Thank you.